Okay, and at what point do we want to take our remaining testifier? We'll do that now.
Whenever you're ready. She's here.
Okay, let's go ahead and do that.
So she's connecting to audio right now. Lori, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Great. So, Lori, I'm going to get your last name wrong, Lori, so I'll let you say it. Was the remaining representative from the work groups who did not provide testimony yesterday and is here to share that testimony with you today. So, Lori, if you'd like to go ahead.
Sure, thank you. It's Kuykendall. If you're from Houston, you know the street Kuykendall. So thank you for having me. I'm glad we could share this time together today. I represent Work Group D, the subgroup on reproductive and sexual health. I want to say I appreciate you all and the great amount of diligence and time you've devoted to the Health TEKS review, which really has such significant implications for the children and families of Texas and truly for our nation. I serve as the Executive Director of Medical Institute for Sexual Health based in Dallas. For the past 4 years, I have led AIM for Success, the largest provider of live health education in Texas schools. I served on 3 work groups, A, B, and D. I'll give a quick shout out to the TEA project staff. Of course, Jessica Snyder and others have done an excellent job of facilitating these challenging collaborative groups. You all have heard an immense amount of informative and passionate testimony from all sides of the many issues involved here. Throughout the long day and evening and morning hours yesterday, I observed a tremendous amount of confusion around terminology about how to approach sex ed. So there's abstinence only, abstinence plus, comprehensive sex ed, SRA, SRR. Great confusion exists among professionals in the field and especially among the general public. And there's a lot of misinformation and misrepresentation that I hope we can spend some time clearing up today so that you all will be able to move forward in the process of updating the TEKS. Workgroup D worked diligently and collaboratively to write SEs that are consistent with the language and intent of 28004. As we left them, they were medically accurate, science-based, age-appropriate, and they supported optimal physical, mental, emotional, and relational health for all Texas students. We included extensive content on anatomy and physiology, healthy relationships, preventing sexual abuse and dating violence, respect for all students, setting, communicating, and respecting personal boundaries, the risks of STDs and STIs and pregnancy, the emotional risks of sexual activity, and the effectiveness and ineffectiveness of contraception. Workgroup E ventured away from this content in a few places and made several concerning content changes I'd like to address. My recommendations here also align with the content advisor's consensus recommendations you heard about yesterday. So first, the addition of or committed relationships in the marriage topic should be removed. Second, the emotional impact of sexual activity should be reinstated to 6th grade, and the increased risk of suicidal thoughts added back to Health 1. And third, and most concerning to me, was the addition of teaching consent, which, as you are aware, by definition is giving permission, moving towards sexual activity, which is not what we want to teach school-age children. This content should be removed and continued emphasis given to refusal and resistance skills and protective boundary setting, as was written in Workgroup D. I'll also recommend adding back in fetal development and the benefits of delayed dating. Last recommendation I have is that we use consistent language throughout all 6 strands about where students should be guided to seek help. We should say repetitively parents, family members, or trusted adults. Texas teen pregnancy, birth, abortion, and sexual activity rates have fallen steadily and significantly for 20 years. What isn't falling, however, are STDs and the emotional and mental risks. All teens need to be fully aware of all these risks and given clear instruction and full support of the adults who love and care for them to avoid these risks. This is a message for all children in Texas, and I hope we can uphold that together. I've provided written testimony that is specific to these student expectations. I have, of course, I'm welcome to additional questions about these issues. Thank you so much.
Before we get any questions from members, I do want to clarify, Ms. Kuykendall, just so we understand, is the testimony you're giving or what you just stated there, is that your personal testimony, or is that the testimony on speaking on behalf of Work Group D, that specifically the sexual health and reproduction stand? I guess clarifying, is that the consensus of Work Group D or your personal feelings?
The consensus of Work Group D is represented in the student expectations and the recommendations that were presented after our collaborative work in that time frame. And that's what I'm speaking to. Then the changes that were brought into Work Group E, we didn't have but one of our representatives on Work Group E to represent the content we had diligently worked into Work Group D.
Perfect, thank you. All right, I'm going to begin with Ms. Little and then Ms. Perez-Diaz.
All right, first of all, I want to start off by thanking you. I know you stayed with us all night last night, hoping that we would get to you. So I really appreciate your diligence and that you care enough to have stayed with us last night. One of the things that I know you heard a lot about last night is that these TEKs that have been presented are not inclusive. And we heard particularly a lot for the LGBT group. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, on how you feel about that?
Absolutely. I think when we take an approach, as we have written in Work Group D, all students need this health information. The medically accurate health information presented there applies to all students and should be presented as such. Another thing I would say regarding the LGBTQ issues, as said in many testimonies yesterday, there's a lot of confusion. If there's confusion among adults, there's going to be great confusion among children in classrooms as well. And I think we need to be reminded that the student expectations in the TEKs are a minimum standard. We know 28004 gives a lot of content around sexuality instruction back to the local level, the local school health advisory council making recommendations to the school board. My point being, we would put a minimum where there's not confusion, again, keeping an approach for all students that's appropriate. That is inclusive in that regard, and then would allow local districts to continue to kind of grapple with what's best needed in their communities.
Okay, thank you. And I also feel like when we use the word inclusive, we need to talk about how that affects all students. I mean, we know how cruel students can be to each other. They can be bullying to a student that's too thin, one that's too fat. And I think now an issue in some of our schools is some of our students are wearing a specific religious clothing as their religious right to do. And so I really think that what we need to be sure we do here is that we are inclusive of all students. And so I appreciate your comments.
Well, and I would add to that, I would remind the members here that there are several places, injury and violence prevention and bullying prevention, mental health and healthy relationships, that those themes about respecting all children are included across all 6 strands.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next up, Ms. Perez-Diaz.
Thank you, Chair. So I think since we're on the LGBTQIA conversation, I do want to first and foremost clarify. So yes, there was a lot of confusion among some of the adults that testified yesterday. But what I will say, and I want to make very clear, is that every single youth that stayed with us yesterday, that came and that testified, did not seem confused about what LGBTQIA is and what it is that they're wanting. And I mean, these individuals represented Texas, it was like a broadly. And so I think that what's happening is that there's confusion among adults because we didn't get this education. I think we would be doing a disservice if we didn't attempt to do this for our youth who are asking us for it. They are the ones that are experiencing education in the most direct way, and we are creating those standards for them. It is our responsibility as a board to do that. And so I want to ask you, did you, ma'am, when you were listening to the testimony yesterday, get any sense of confusion from the youth that were speaking to us?
I didn't. As I would agree with you, there was a lot of clear testimony given from students. I would make the point, though, there were several of them, and there are 5 million students that we're representing. So I think we want to be careful about making broad generalizations of qualitative testimony. It was heartfelt. It was genuine. I don't question any of it. A lot of what I heard those students asking for was medically accurate information on healthy relationships, on sexual risks, and that's included as we've got them in work group D.
Okay, well, and I will say, you know, if you're going to make the point about the generalization of a small group of students, that same would go for the confusion, you know, to your point, the small group of individuals that we had of adults yesterday, because we had a good contingent of adults that were also very clear in their understanding, and in fact came and advocated for their own children and wanting this. And so when we talk about LGBTQ students, just like everyone else, they deserve to learn in settings that are, you know, I know that inclusivity scared somebody or is not, you know, I don't like inclusivity. It's very, very easy to understand. It is ensuring that everybody is represented in a conversation, in a space. So I don't see any kind of exclusionary acts taking place if we include LGBTQIA perspectives in the conversation. And so their experiences also deserve to have accurate information presented to them. And when I say that, I'm speaking specifically to sex orientation and gender identity. The other thing I wanted to ask was, and maybe this is a question for Shelley or Monica, but this is just for my clarification. So committed relationships was something that was added by work group E. Did it exist in a TEKS before work group D?
I don't believe it did, no.
Okay, thank you. And then I think the last thing I wanted to ask, Lori, was you mentioned that the responsibility of having these conversations about gender identity and sexual orientation and those sorts of things should fall to the parents, family, or trusted adults. So I'll come to you from the perspective of a child protective services caseworker. Many of my students had, like, the only consistent adults in their lives were teachers. And teachers would love to be a support and help to guide students through this conversation. But if there isn't something in place, like a standard that they can, you know, it's been vetted, they can walk through with these kids, then answering questions like this, there's a liability to it for their own jobs. And so they may be fearful to offer that support when they are the only support system for some of these kids. And so I think it's really important, again, for us to be inclusive in our curriculum. And again, it's being vetted by a bunch of adults, and, you know, by bringing in professionals in the field who can provide medically accurate information. Would you disagree with that?
No, in fact, I would add to it. I think inclusivity, especially from the testimonies yesterday, wasn't just about LGBTQ. AI plus students. It was also about different ethnicities, different socioeconomic demographics, different family situations. We talked about a lot of diversity and different situations. And what I was asking for in the student expectations was consistent language. I think your idea to put teacher in is really strong. So maybe and it's all throughout the strands that we put seeking help. This help seeking that we're promoting would always be to a parent, family member, teacher, or trusted adult. Maybe would make that stronger. I'm just asking that it be consistent throughout the TEKS.
Okay, is that it, Ms. Perez-Diaz? Okay, I've got Ms. Cargill and then, no, I'm sorry, Dr. Robinson and then Ms. Cargill.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Kuykendall, for everything you've done, work y'all did on work group D. You threw a lot out there. And I didn't write it all down, but the point I was making, you might have, if you were listening most of the day or all day yesterday, that my background is a physician. And so I kind of look at things from a pragmatic sense, not necessarily from an ideology sense, but I know that nationwide that pregnancy rates are going down, and that's just kind of across the board, but still, in Texas, we are in the top 10, if not the top 5, in terms of teen pregnancy rate. And then when you combine that statistic with that approximately 50% of high school seniors are sexually active, then I think that generally speaking, we need to have a system that emphasizes abstinence. I agree with that 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, but I think that being realistic though, and getting away from some utopian society, we're not going to achieve, that's not going to be possible to get to where 0 high school kids are engaged in sexual activity. So, and in reality, there's probably going to be a fair number that do. You might, you can reduce that some, I believe. So accounting for the significant number that are sexually active, I think that you need to address contraception in order to bring down the pregnancy rate and also bring down the sexually transmitted infection rate. Those are kind of the main things that I would like to see kind of done differently compared to what has been done with the TEKS from 22 years ago. Does that kind of match up with what you just said? I'm not sure.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. You can see in workgroup D, we put extensive language in around sexually transmitted diseases, sexually transmitted infections, teen pregnancy, and then contraception as well. The language that's out of the law about effectiveness and ineffectiveness or human use reality rates is what we included. So we are advocating for teaching about contraception. I think y'all may remember from your November meeting, a handout was given that was kind of a grid. I actually have a picture of it. I don't know if anybody has it, where we kind of tried to sort out some of the definitions. You all recommended that be passed to the work groups. I don't know if you can see on my screen, but you can see across the top some definitions about sexual risk avoidance and sexual risk reduction. Then we've got abstinence only, abstinence plus, and comprehensive sex education. We've heard a lot of testimony for comprehensive sex education, and we've heard some about abstinence plus, but I'll point out to you an important line down the middle of an abstinence plus. Is it a sexual risk avoidance message or a sexual risk reduction message? And I would point out that the sexual risk avoidance message of abstinence plus is exactly what Workgroup D has written, where comprehensive information is given about contraception, all with the goal of optimal health. Just like we advocate all students going to college, all students doing their best in school, I think that's the approach we've wanted to take. These are intended to be standards for healthy behavior and healthy lifestyle. So that's some of the perspective there that we've taken with what we've written across Workgroup D.
And one more question, and I don't know the answer to this, but regarding bullying and self-esteem, you know, bullying is about kids that are different in some way are bullied, and it can be from a long list of reasons. I think Representative Little, you know, kind of referred to that. And certainly in terms of the bullying and the self-esteem, I don't know if in what area, maybe it needs to be in a social emotional learning class, but the bullying and self-esteem are bigger issues for the LGBT kids than they are just for the average kid. And I think it would be good to reach them somehow, to address that, to let them know that, you know, they do have self-worth. And I don't know exactly the best way to get that. Maybe it needs to be in a different course, but I think somehow it would be good to address that.
Thank you. And again, I would refer you to injury and violence prevention, where a lot of that bullying content is, which is not where I've focused on for this subgroup topic on reproductive and sexual health. I also would caution, again, thinking back to classroom applications, how is this information taught? How do the teachers bring up these discussions? Sometimes pointing out LGBTQ students in a classroom can invite some of the bullying you're referring to as well. So I think because of the confusion, across, as been said, among adults and into a classroom setting for 5 million students, I would stick with the language that is inclusive for all students across how children should be treated because of their inherent value and worth.
yeah, that helps. I thank your answers.
Thank
I've
you.
got Ms. Cargill and Ms. Hardy who are raising their physical hands, and I'll go to the members who had their Zoom hands raised. So Ms. Cargill.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Lori. Thank you for serving on 3 different work groups. That's pretty amazing. That's a lot of your time. So we appreciate it. And
It's actually a pretty interesting process. If you haven't sat in those rooms, the collaborative process, challenging, but good. I think the teams have done a lot of good hard work together for the state.
yes. I've observed many of them over the years, but not the health group this year. But I do want to remind the board too that because I don't want it to sound like that the TEKS have never required the teaching of contraceptives or STDs and STIs. That is in the current Health 1 TEKS under number 8C, I think. But the big difference is that you've actually lowered the grade. Can you address that? Is it 7th grade or 8th grade or 6th grade, or what was that thought process?
Well, back when the TEKS were first written, right, health was a required course, was my understanding. That Health 1 was a required course for high school graduation. So the problem now, it isn't anymore. Thankfully, a lot of districts still include it, or I would say thankfully. But because now it's no longer required at the high school level, we had a lot of discussion and a lot of work over what should drop down then into 7th and 8th grade so that it would be required for all students across the state. And that's why it landed down in 7th and 8th as still required content to be delivered.
Okay. So yeah, thank you. I just want to make sure. I think, unfortunately, from a lot of the testimony we heard yesterday, there was a lot of blame on the TEKS. And I wasn't around back then. I wasn't on the board back then. I was around back then. But, so it just seems like a lot of the TEKS are not being taught. And of course, as you mentioned, Health 1 is not a required course anymore. So one of the other big topics that you actually addressed most of my questions that I might have had, but one of the big topics that seems to keep coming up is work group E inserted the words committed relationship kind of on an even par with marriage. And they use the word or. And so in the standard, it gives teachers the option to describe how healthy marriages or committed relationships can contribute to, healthy families or emotional benefits and et cetera, et cetera. Do you know any of the thought process that went into keeping it just focused on marriage, or have you looked into that? I know you were on the sexual reproduction and health piece, but.
Sure. All I can do as far as addressing why E would have added it is to look at their rationale. So the comments they provided, this is on page 111 if you have the colorful version, but they gave the rationale that the work group would like to be more inclusive with the language used. There was some concern that students who are learning the benefits of a healthy committed relationship will feel inferior because they come from a home where the parents are not married or they are living with grandparents or others. So they wanted to add, from what I understand, or committed relationships. You'll see the topic to be addressed here was marriage. And in the research, there is a difference between marriage and its benefits for both those who are married and their children than committed relationships. You can do a quick Google search to see those benefits of marriage for children. And it might go back to the point I mentioned earlier in terms of these are standards for all children. Just like we set academic standards, knowing some won't live up to them. We teach English and reading, even though some of their parents have not. There's some of those issues I see in that same kind of thinking. So the standard here was around marriage specifically, and or, as you've said, makes it unclear to the teacher, and it shouldn't be there at all, in my opinion. It should just stick to marriage.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you again for serving. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right, we've got Ms. Pettis, and then Mr. Mercer, and then Ms. Bahorich. I'm
Thank
sorry.
you.
Wait. I forgot Ms. Hardy. She was after Ms. Cargill.
Oh, yes, please, by all means, Ms. Hardy, more questions.
Well, I'm so confused now because we've skipped around so many ways, but I do thank you, Laura, for your contribution to this. I think you're very well spoken. One of the things that I actually had to do when I was working for Weatherford ISD was to work with this whole thing of the sex education, and we depended upon the SHAC committee a great deal, and I think that's something that every school district needs to be very much aware of, that SHAC committee is selected to represent different aspects of the community. It's not made up of the people in the school district, it's made up of the community. And that is where, whenever some of these things get to be a problem, that we need to, that is an outlet so that the state doesn't make a decision for all the students in the state, but they can make that as a local decision. And it was our local decision to actually teach a lot of this stuff, like you're talking about the STDs and so forth, in the 6th grade. And that was under the auspices of a very conservative program called Worth the Wait. So it's not as if all these things have been teaching, and those of you who are new to the board, it's not as if abstinence is what is being taught exclusively. There is abstinence, but you have to have knowledge to understand why the abstinence is there. And so all these things, the birth control, it's just that how it's carried out can be changed from one district to the next. And that's where the local district and individuals can speak up and be a part of that and see to it that certain things are done on the local level. And avoids a statewide controversy about that whole thing. I would suppose that the Worth the Wait was kind of a risk avoidance in their strategy and their point of view. They wanted kids to know about these things, but they certainly emphasize the idea of abstinence is the main way to go. So I think you did an excellent job of explaining what you just did, what you just gave to us, and I think we need to look at that as additions to or changes made in what we have right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hardy. I would emphasize the SHAC is very important, and working with a number of SHACs across the state, they're all very different. We could talk about compliance or non-compliance even on the SHAC level for sure. But I would say that the legislation is there, the statute is there, that they would have the control over what content is taught in their community. Around our circles, we kind of call this the big if of 28004, that we have been told by TEA is being looked at legally, that can we require in the TEKS human sexuality instruction if the big if is not resolved out of 28004. So I think there's a lot still to be determined in that, but I think we're making good progress in the content that could be agreeable across the state. So
explain to me what you're talking about. You mean like some school districts don't teach abstinence and they just teach, or they forego that law, or what?
Well, the statute is 28004, as we call it in the Texas Education Code, right, which does not require sex education in Texas. If it is taught, it gives it a clear direction and the language around abstinence until marriage, contraception in terms of human use reality rates. That exact language was what we wrote into Workgroup D. But again, it's if, and if it is taught, it is determined by the SHAC. Which makes recommendations to the school board. And as you've said, the SHAC is to be a majority of parents from the community members that are not employees of the school district. And that happens most of the time, but not always.
Yeah, I started saying, have you found some school districts use only people within the school district, not community leaders and so forth?
There's just a wide variety. Yes.
Okay, but anyway, I think you did a good job with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kuykendall, for joining us again today. I know this is not something that we normally do, so I thank you for taking time again to be here. If I'm correct, there were 5 work groups, right? A, B, C, D, E?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
So there were 5.
Uh-huh.
And which ones were you on?
A and B and D.
Okay, and who do you work for?
I work for Medical Institute for Sexual Health.
Right, and that's an abstinence-only curriculum provider, am I correct?
No, ma'am, we do not provide curriculum. And we are a medical source of information primarily around sexually transmitted diseases. Been in existence since 1993 here, so out of Austin, recently relocated to Dallas. I just joined their staff, having been with Aim for Success for 4 years.
And so that doesn't provide any kind of guidance or anything to SHAC committees for ISDs?
Oh, absolutely, we would if we were asked. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of in my dual role. I've visited with lots of SHACs through our work with Aim for Success.
Right. And you don't do that anymore?
Medical Institute would absolutely consult with SHACs as needed on these issues for sure.
And do you still work with Aim for Success? Do you still provide that information to SHAC committees?
Yes,
Do you
yes,
do
we
both?
do. We are a live program. I don't even like to use curriculum because we complement curriculum. So we provided live presentations, about 95 school districts this year.
Okay. That's fair. Thank you for clarifying that for me. So I think you said earlier that regardless of what the State Board of Education includes as it pertains to this specific content area, a SHAC committee can go in and decide we're not going to do any of this at all, correct?
That's how I understand the law,
because
yes.
the SHAC, right. So that's okay. And so it would make more sense that the State Board of Education include it for the school districts that want, for the SHACs that want, right? So they have clear guidance. And then if a SHAC determines that their community doesn't want it, then they simply remove it, much like what our chair just said. Is that
Actually,
accurate?
I'm sorry. I think I misunderstood your question and misspoke. It is my understanding legally, and I'm not a lawyer, that if it goes into TEKS as Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, then it is required instruction for every school. And that's kind of the issue we were talking about with this. Can we require it in TEKS, or is it left at the local control of the SHAC? A SHAC, in my understanding, couldn't overrule the TEKS, but that's legal, and I'm not sure all those different pieces.
Okay, and even if once we have that clarified, a parent can still opt their kid out of this content, just like any other content, right?
Yes, that is in the law. Parents are notified of all of the instruction and then given the option to opt their child out.
Great. And so you were not part of work group E, right? You said A, B, and D, like boy and dog, but not E like elephant, correct?
That is correct. No elephant.
Okay. And thank you. And so work group E is the one that had quite a bit of a differing opinion or a different perspective from yours, right? And so I'm wondering if that's not a reason that we're trying to pull all of this together with another work group, because I find that to be a conflict of interest, particularly because we've had teachers working on this and we have a rotating green constant moving curriculum or moving work groups, so that there's not a whole lot of ownership with one particular person or one particular group. And there's a very specific reason we did that. And so of 5 work groups, you were already on 3. And I would say, number one, thank you for all of the time that you've spent, because I find it to be quite a bit. I think the last question I have, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to clarify. Only one concern I have with work group E. First, a couple of things that I could say. One is in terms of representation. So from our strand, we had 8 members, and only one of our 8 went forward to E. And I think that was probably a miss, because I think 2 or 3 should have been brought forward to really represent the collaborative work that work group D accomplished. So that's one piece. I didn't feel like it was, well represented across the different strands and the work group Ds into E. That's one piece. Another problem with E was that they were given the charge mainly of vertical alignment and reducing eliminating duplication, sorry. And absolutely, they went, beyond that, which I understand is still part of the process, but there were some pretty significant changes that I've addressed and we can address further. But then the other part of that is all of our work group times were open for public viewing, right? And given coronavirus and all the changes, there was no longer public observation around work group E. Their virtual sessions were not made open for public. And I had a little bit of a concern about that. They also had an extended amount of time. I think you all are aware it was a long time till strand 6 finally dropped into E. And we had a tight time frame that had to be met, and we didn't get to give quite enough time. I would have liked to have given on legal implications and contraception.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a long
Well,
answer about E.
No, that's very good, because that's exactly what I needed to know, because I was kind of missing why are we paying so much more attention to one than the other? But knowing that there weren't many teachers that moved from D to E, that probably explains it, right?
Mhm.
So yesterday we were talking with Amy, and I apologize, I don't know her last name, but I took a great deal of notes when she was speaking, and she was the individual who was representing the work groups, speaking about reproduction and sexual health, right? And she said that LGBTQ inclusion was great importance to all of the work groups, that there wasn't a lot of confusion with the work groups, and that not only was it important, but that they made a point to emphasize that the LGBTQ community, particularly of our students, they have higher instances of sexual abuse and rape, and that their inclusivity was of great importance to all of the work groups. It seems like maybe that wasn't the case with work group E, but perhaps then that was the case with the A, B, C, and D. Do I understand that correctly?
Well, if you read all the way through A and B, C did not work on strand 6, and then D and E, there hasn't been language around sexual orientation and gender identity yet. So I don't think that's a fair statement to say all of the work groups wanted LGBTQ inclusivity. I think we stuck, as I mentioned earlier, with the broader language of inclusivity for all students across bullying prevention, mental health and healthy relationships, and all of that.
Okay. Just a few moments ago, you said something, and I could have written it down wrong, because, you know, sometimes taking notes, that happens. But I think you said 28004 says abstinence until marriage. And I think it says abstinence emphasis. So I want to make sure that if
sure, would you like? I have it. If you would like me to read the language, marriage appears in several places through 1 through 5 in section E.
Right, and so is that it's not an abstinence emphasis, it's an abstinence until marriage.
Well, emphasize is one of the words, yes. I think someone referenced they were trying to get you all 28004. That's the language we looked at when we wrote work group D. So present abstinence from sexual activity as preferred choice of behavior in relationship to all sexual activity for unmarried persons of school age, for example, is the first one. Devote more attention to abstinence from sexual activity than to any other behavior. Emphasize that abstinence from sexual activity goes on from there and is the standard of unmarried school age children. Abstinence from sexual activity before marriage is the most effective way. That's the language we used.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that for me. Those are all of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I believe we have Mr. Mercer next, and then Mr. Horch.
Good morning, Ms. Kuykendall. Thank you. And that's why I stressed that I passed that out last November. We started it again in January, because you just read subchapter E, section 1, 2, and 3, abstinence preferred method. Emphasis. It even says emphasize that it's a sexual activity consistently 100% accurate. That's the law, which I think we're under as a state board right now to cover. My questions begin with, I guess the main thing is that what we've seen so far in work group D and E, are we still doing abstinence first?
Well, work group D had the focus of the law, and then I mentioned several places where language was added or changed that I think stretched that a bit, directed it a different direction, closer towards comprehensive sex education and sexual risk reduction versus an abstinence plus with sexual risk avoidance. And again, the language is complicated there. I'm happy to clarify where needed. You all looked at this somewhat earlier in the fall.
I understand avoidance. I passed that out too, what avoidance was, what reduction was. We talked about in the sections here 1 through 5 about the disease transmission.
Mhm.
See, that's covered here. Medically accurate is another question that comes in debate. It talks about here about terms of condoms in terms of human use reality rates versus theoretical laboratory rates. How do we address that?
Well, as the language says, human use reality rates is different than a laboratory rate, right? And the trick with young people especially is there's not a lot of research done. So human use reality rates is often adult use reality rates, but it is the information we can share with students about effectiveness and ineffectiveness. And that's looking across the spectrum of risk. So pregnancy is one piece of it. About 1 in 7 girls get pregnant with typical condom use, for example. We can get some pretty high contraception rates around hormonal contraception or long-acting reversible contraception. We've heard discussion around that. Then you start looking at prevention of STDs and STIs, which is continually brought up, which is not decreasing, as we've heard. So then you look differently at these forms of methods. And when it comes to STDs spread through fluid, condoms or barrier protection are better. When it comes to STDs and STIs spread through skin to skin contact, condoms, as we tell young people, quite literally don't cover all the skin in that area. So according to the Centers for Disease Control, condoms may protect or offer little protection against HPV and herpes simplex virus, some of these skin to skin. That's how you help young people understand their risks.
That's perfect, because when I read the articles about Planned Parenthood, I'm hearing something like 90%. But when I read CDC, the Center for Disease Control, I'm finding, well, the other parts, the real rate, what's really happening. Thank you for sharing. Just a couple more questions I want to mention about. I heard a lot about consent from everyone, about consent and healthy relationships. Very concerned about that. Overwhelming theme was pornography and dating violence. And this is from every group who spoke. And how are we addressing that?
Well, I think it's interesting to me, as I referenced in my testimony, consent by definition is permission, right? Giving permission, moving towards a behavior. If we're talking about avoiding sexual activity, then that's a different direction. That's moving away from, that's refusal or resistance skills as we use in the language.
Mhm.
Consent sounds like something that absolutely should be taught, especially in light of all the sexual abuse and harassment and Me Too and all of that. But when you look at what's actually instructed by these providers of comprehensive sex education around consent, I think we find some pretty concerning content. I might reference you to, there's a reference, actually you've heard from the Texas campaign. If you get on their website, txcampaign.org, and at the bottom, they've got a link to the complete guide to teaching kids consent at every age. I would encourage you to check that out and see if that feels consistent with what you'd heard in language the last couple of days. So things like teaching preschoolers and early elementary their correct anatomy. So they should know vulva, clitoris, vagina, anus. Teaching late elementary and middle school about misogyny and sexism. And most concerning to me, amongst other things at the high school level, pornography. You'll see in that article they reference fair trade porn or ethical feminine pornography. And we've heard testimony to concerns around pornography, and yet these groups advocate for healthy pornography use. So that's where consent usually goes. You can also Google what is consent. You can get on Planned Parenthood's website, watch their videos on consent, and decide if that's what you want for Texas children.
Actually, I've seen 2 of the 4 videos Planned Parenthood. I didn't want to see any more, but I understood what they're trying to say, but I didn't agree with it. And to be honest, parents have brought to me complaints from even kindergarten, some of the vocabulary you mentioned for 4 and 5-year-olds. I mean, in all this last thing, that again, the reoccurring theme of pornography and violence, but there's a whole section here we have I think it's very inclusive, because I know that when you start to delineate, you become exclusive, either now or in the future. And the whole section on injury and violence prevention, safety, interpersonal violence, where it goes to bullying, it goes to harassment, it goes to cyberbullying, all the different types of pornography, teasing, joking, how do you peer pressure, who do you talk to? I look at this, and to me, I read it as very inclusive, because we don't list We just say, if this happens, no matter the circumstance, this is bullying, this is cyberbullying, this is harassment. And we have a whole section on that. So I'm not sure, I would argue that, and to caution that if we delineate, we risk becoming exclusive, not inclusive. Right now, this is inclusive. It says no matter who you are, like the parent yesterday said, because they were Christian and someone asked, what do you really feel? Well, I think optimally, she said that marriage is a one man, one woman, you know, whatever else, and all of a sudden she's being harassed. I would have her included in this, as would anyone else who had a different sexual lifestyle. It's still bullying, cyberbullying. My point is, the words we have now, to me, is inclusive because it covers anything that's bullied, cyberbullying, or harassment. Am I wrong about that, or do we need to beat that up?
Well, as has been addressed, there are a lot of important topics we want included in the TEKS. I think we've certainly been challenged to cut them down to a reasonable time to teach, because these are life issues and health and well-being issues. And I think, you know, we all get passionate about them. I think the essays that we have address the key issues. You reference sexting and pornography. They're there in terms of digital safety and online safety.
Yes.
They don't need to be written in 5 places, but they do need to be clear and taught well to protect kids. I would kind of follow up to the watch out for pornography. A lot of groups have been sort of promoting safe pornography during COVID-19 and some other things like that. And we could talk a lot, as testimony was yesterday, about the physical and emotional, relational dangers of pornography really being called the new sex education for our kids. So we've got to talk about it. We've got to help parents talk about it so that kids are informed with what's really right and best for their health.
Any further
I think the
questions?
message I heard, we want to hear no one be bullied. We want no child for any reason being bullied.
Absolutely.
I do think it's important to point out that we're referencing other groups who have testified. I think it's very fair to discuss their testimony that they gave to us, but not necessarily something that they didn't testify to, or something we may feel that that group believes in that wasn't part of the testimony. So I think that's important, especially when they're not here. That issue came up with a certain individual yesterday that wasn't here to defend themselves. So I think that's an important point in this aspect too. Ms. Bohorch was next. There she is.
Yes, I just had a couple of questions, and then I wanted to talk to you about some specifics on the abstinence area that I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on before we make some recommendations to staff for the next group. Do you think that the contraception, you know, were there discussions, you know, give me some insight in the committees, like were there discussions about the way to do contraception that, you know, how they should be addressed, I guess is my question.
Well, I think we kind of went off of the original content advisors recommendations, and then the second more recent content advisors, where they talked about effectiveness and ineffectiveness, the rates that are there for risks, and that would include side effects as well. So I think just the factual information, medically accurate information is there on contraception.
Okay, great. And then do you have any insight you can give us? Because the instruction that we gave, and I don't remember which meeting, I don't know if it was April, I think it was before that, maybe January, where we had that whole discussion on risk avoidance separation from risk reduction separation, and kind of any discussions around how that looked or whatever.
Sure. There was direction from the November meeting about how to include SRA and SRR, and I would kind of go back to my little chart I showed you all earlier. Those concepts cannot coexist. I think, again, in terms of the confusion around definitions, a lot of times people think sexual risk reduction means teaching contraception, sexual risk avoidance doesn't, and that's just not accurate, or at least in the field. And so there is a place to teach about contraception. It's different than advocating for. That was there. So what we did in Workgroup D was we took all of the risks and laid them out, right? So that's all the risks of teen sexual activity. That's pregnancy, STDs and STIs, and the emotional risks, although I did address that they were pulled from 6th grade. and I would like them back in 6th grade. The emotional risks, and then we also talked about legal risks, and then from there went into prevention. So I think the clear message is prevention, and protecting the health of kids from those risks that we've laid out that way. So we kind of reshifted it, realigned it, so it had a clearer health message of primary prevention.
Okay, great. And then we had a lot of testimony yesterday about advocating comprehensive versus abstinence plus. So I think if what you're saying is that chart that we all got a copy of before kind of addresses what that looks like, right?
Abstinence plus is where the great confusion comes. You heard reference to a poll several times about
right.
abstinence plus, right? When you look at that definition given in the poll, it didn't include many of the things that were spoken of yesterday. So many advocated for abortion, LGBTQ sex, those kinds of things in abstinence plus. It all depends on how you define it. And I think you'd have to continue to come back to the words that we wrote in work group D to get that clear sexual risk avoidance message, which does include teaching on contraception and many of the important healthy relationship topics, personal boundaries, refusal skills, resistance skills that abstinence only is often characterized as lacking.
Okay. All right. And so I wanted to kind of go over some things, and I went ahead and emailed this to you because I knew you were speaking today. So that list of things that I think are concepts that, I'd like to have the next group kind of visit that actually support abstinence. Because to me, in looking at the overall look of what we're saying about abstinence, it really is focused on a just say no kind of thing. And I would like to see more robust support and kind of fleshing out a plan, a recovery, from going off your plan, how to get support around your plan, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. More emphasis on that. So I would like to kind of go down this list just to, or maybe you want to talk about, well, let me go down this list. Mm-hmm. One of the things I think it's important for kids to know is that sexual feelings are common to all young adolescents. It's not like, one has it in isolation and, oh, am I weird because I'm thinking about this? This is stuff that happens for all adolescents. And, but there's a big difference between having sexual feelings and acting on them, and just kind of making sure that there's a clear understanding about that. All those feelings are in common, but actions also are different than feelings, is one of the topics. And I don't know if you want to take these one at a time, because I've got several here. So how do you think we should do it?
Well, it's a great list, I think, and I appreciate you sending it to me. So I'm happy to go one by one if you've got the time. I think a lot of the concepts are in other areas across the strands as well. So, dealing with peer pressure, I think was one of them, or, however you want to handle it, Ms. Bahorich.
Well, if you think the list that I sent, which has got like 10 items in it, are really kind of already addressed in the standards, then actually I wouldn't need to worry so much about building support around abstinence. It just seemed lacking to me. And maybe if there's any in that group that I sent you that you think, okay, we could beef up this area here, that would be helpful, maybe to me, if you knowing the standards as you do is what I'm trying to say. If you can point out to me things that how they're addressed, and I don't need to reinvent the wheel, and I don't want to do that. Like Ms. Pettis says, we need to streamline. We cannot just go on and on and on here. And we've got to be careful about that. So I don't know, whatever. Go ahead.
Well, I just, there's a lot of comprehensive, if I could use that word, content on, even on the first page of work group E, right, of this section, right, describe healthy ways to express friendship, affection, and love, appropriate methods and effective methods of communicating emotions. And this is not even in the healthy relationships content. There's a lot of information even over in alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs that talks about peer pressure and resistance skills and goal setting, and some of that I know was brought about too. So I think there's a lot. I mean, all of us, goodness, have, it's hard to digest all that's there in the however many hundreds of SEs that are sitting there right now. But I do think we were broader in work group D than some of the concern testimony represented.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. I do think things like developing a personal standard, your own personal standards for dating. To me, I didn't really see that. Maybe I'm just missing it the way the standards are written. Because it is very personal, like what my own goals are, like, what is it that I want to achieve through my dating, kind of helping kids think that through. Could be very beneficial in helping them to have the right strategy to remain abstinent and to be protective of themselves. And so, did we have something in the standards that, and I'm wondering about that, if you have, hard relationship or a difficult relationship, like how you handle that, like how is it that you, move on from that person? And because that's always a thing, you kind of get stuck in a situation and then you don't know what to do and you don't want to be by yourself. And, how do you really kind of think through that?
I don't think we've addressed the whole breakup situation that you're bringing to light. And the whole, there's always opportunity across all of these health behaviors to go back to healthy behaviors. It's easier to set them on a good path and keep them on it, but we know they will at times where wave away from that. So we've got to be able to, like you said, give them those resilience skills and recovery skills to get back to a place of pursuing optimal health. So I think there's a lot to that could certainly be added. I don't think I'm not aware of where we talked about handling breakups and getting over relationships.
Okay. And then probably the last thing is, I did not see anything that talked about, how you encourage friends to remain abstinent and return back to abstinence if you've been sexually active. And that had come up in the testimony that we're talking about yesterday. And I think that's kind of an important thing to understand. You don't just kind of make a plan, don't tell anybody, don't get support around it. You're not going to be very successful. You have to gather support around any plan, whether it's a life goal plan, educational plan, whatever it is. You got to learn how to gather support around those goals and plans that you have for yourself. And so I just, that whole resilience thing, like bouncing back, oh gosh, I got off track here. I don't want to do that. That's not what I'm trying to do now. Let me get back on track. That's important in the sexual area as well as some of these other areas that we've got that kind of behavior in. Or want to encourage that kind of behavior. Yeah.
Excellent suggestion.
And probably, I think, the last thing is, when you're putting that plan together about personal standards for dating and stuff, the other thing that I think that kids need to think about is their own, personal, peer and family values kind of and beliefs, that those things also influence your decision making and your sexual health, like considering the whole totality of your life and what you believe and what you value. I didn't see anything that says that comes as part of your thinking about abstinence, like considering the total picture, if you will. And it seems like to me that's a pretty important thing because you're not an island in this.
I think that speaks to some of the emotional and relational risks that are there as well. I think we talk about short-term and long-term and need to do that better also. I think it also is couched by the whole discussion about teen brains, right? And how able are they to think that broad and long-term also. But I think it's absolutely important instruction to include. I appreciate your recommendations.
Yeah. So anyway, that's, to think about values and beliefs, I think is pretty important in this particular discussion. So on these kinds of topics. So, okay, I think that's it for kind of just supporting the concept rather than just saying no thing on abstinence.
Mr. Riley next.
Lori, thank you for your time here today. I'll try to be as brief as possible so we can let you go. One item that I wanted to talk about, though, is just kind of for clarification. My understanding from your comments, and I think you might have just expressly said this, that work group D's version followed more of a risk reduction type of approach as compared to work group E that took more of a risk avoidance type of approach. Is that accurate?
I apologize, Mr. Rowley. That was exactly opposite.
Oh.
So work group D was risk avoidance, and
okay.
work group E was risk reduction, if you use the terms that way, yes.
Okay, I thought I had that backwards when I wrote it down, but I just wanted to clear that. So work group D then was risk avoidance and E was risk reduction.
The best way I can help you understand, help everyone understand that if you think about avoiding a risk is, for lack of a better way, it's to just say no piece, but it's safety, it's avoiding the risk.
Right.
Comprehensive sex education teaches risk reduction. So you can choose the risky behavior, but you're going to reduce your risk, but have not eliminated the risk. The language in the law speaks to 100% effectiveness of abstinence from sexual activity until marriage, which is a risk avoidance message.
I thought you meant the other way around. Maybe I'm sure I misheard it. That's why I was trying to.
Okay, yeah, and I could have certainly misspoken, so I apologize. It is confusing.
That's okay. And so if the process that we adopt going forward is to create another work group that would be a composite of members that have been on the previous work groups, would you be willing to serve on what would essentially be a work group F if you were asked to do so?
Absolutely, Mr. Rowley. Thank you. If that were agreeable, I think obviously from the weight, the number of testimonies around this particular strand and topic, I think we need several representatives from the work group D on this strand.
Okay. Yeah, and I would assert that you're probably one of the most qualified since you've already been involved in the process throughout. So I think it would be fitting if you were in the final group as well. So very good.
Thank you.
One, maybe a couple more things. One is I've noticed several times in the, I think it's the mental health strand where it talks about seeking trusted adult guidance and also telling a trusted adult. I don't see the word parent or parental guidance there, and I understand that not everyone's going to have a parent that they're going to be able to go to, but certainly a large number of children will have a parent that they can go to. And so was there a thought process about leaving out parental guidance there? And secondly, would you object if it was included along with maybe a trusted adult, maybe not to the exclusion of either one?
Thank you. So my recommendation was that we standardize that language across the whole 6 strands, and I haven't done the work to do that yet. I know it gaps in different places. I think children should be taught to seek help from, and we referenced earlier the addition from Ms. Perez-Diaz also, that I would recommend the consistent language of parent, family member, teacher, or trusted adult. Okay. That we would just continue that message in every place across the standards.
Right, but certainly include parent.
First, I think parents need to be there first. Research certainly shows where parent connectedness is, it is one of the most protective factor for kids, but research also shows a number of children don't have that support. So we would want to build in the support behind them around family members, teachers, or trusted adults.
Okay, very good. Okay, that's what I needed. Thank you very much.
I think we got Ms. Perez and Ms. Perez-Diaz, and then we're going to need to move on past this testifier pretty soon because we still have our full discussion to do. Ms. Perez?
Okay, thank you. So I'm hearing a lot about abstinence, return to abstinence, family values, and I'm not, and I don't want this to come across like I don't believe in those things or that they're not important or that they shouldn't be important to other students. But I do want to bring another perspective to this conversation, and I think that my colleague, Mrs. Perez-Diaz, can confirm the numbers that I'm about to tell you. And I think she's going to speak to this because of her experience as a CPS caseworker, but I'm going to tell you this experience because it was the childhood that I experienced, okay? We know that about 1 in 4 girls of color are sexually abused or sexually assaulted before they leave high school. We know how many hundreds of thousands of children are in foster care. And it's almost 100% of girls who are in foster care who are sexually abused or sexually assaulted. So how do we have an abstinence conversation with them? And how do we have a return to abstinence conversation with them that doesn't sound like we're shaming them? How do we have these kinds of conversations with young girls and young boys that doesn't sound like they did something wrong? Because it has been my experience that that's the way abstinence conversations take place every day, still in the 21st century. And so while we're talking about another work group that you'll be part of, because 3 out of 5 wasn't enough, how do we have this kind of conversation that doesn't further traumatize an already at risk, severely at risk group?
Thank you for your question. It is heartbreaking, the number of students, as you've said, 1 in 4 by the time they're 18 are sexually abused. We have to address sexual abuse. But the message is about choice. It's not about something that was not your choice. It's about giving you the best information for you to make the best decisions for your life. So it's acknowledging up front that many of you, as we say in our programs, that in this room, some of you have had a very different situation where sex or sexual activity was forced upon you. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about you having the best information to make the best choices for your life. And girls will tell us, boys will tell us, for the first time ever, they hear in our programs, it was not your fault. No matter what happened, no matter the circumstance, sexual abuse is never your fault. That is proclaimed in an abstinence message. And I hope those that have experienced sexual abuse find that to be quite empowering, that they can have the same opportunity to make healthy decisions as anybody else.
If this is the route that we're going to take, and if we're going to insist that this be the route that we take, and this is what we're going to, and it appears like this is the route we're going to take, and this is what we're going to force in our classrooms, then I'm going to insist that we have very specific language that includes exactly what you just said.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think, again, as I use that word misrepresentation earlier, I think a lot of time there's been misrepresentation over how this kind of information can be given a clear risk avoidance message and offer hope to all children.
Other questions, Ms. Pettis? I've got Ms. Perez-Diaz, and then Ms. Cargill, and then Dr. Robinson. I'm sorry, actually, we're going on second time around. I don't think Ms. Davis has spoken yet, so let me give her a chance to go first, and I'll call Ms. Perez-Diaz.
Oh, thank you. I guess this one's more for staff. So if we include Ms. Kuykendall, I'm sorry if I said that wrong, in the next committee, and I'm pretty sure that she's described herself as being an advocate, very knowledgeable on that risk avoidance. Can we make sure that we kind of have a balance in that group?
Let me add in before Ms. Martinez speaks also that I want to be very clear that the staff has been the one who has chosen the appropriate members to be in each work group.
Right.
The members have done that, and I have not done that, and Ms. Martinez can confirm that. So I don't think we need to get in the aspect of saying this member needs to be on or that particular member needs to be on. I've been very, very, very cautious through this whole process to let that be a process that staff does based on their qualifications. I think it needs to stay that way.
Well, it's not necessarily just pointing to specific people, just making sure that there's a balance, so there's a fair conversation that entire time. That's all. So not necessarily mandating certain people, just ensuring that it's not, because as she said before, one committee was really focused on risk reduction, the other one was really on avoidance. So just to avoid that one or the other, so there's a blend for that fair conversation for all to have a fair voice.
Ms. Martinez, you want to speak to that?
Yes, sir. So Ms. Davis, what I would say about that is that we don't identify work group members, regardless of the subject, with any preconceived notions about what their perspectives are, whether it's a controversial topic or not. We're looking for individuals who have the qualifications to address the topics at hand. I think we try very hard. This is our role is not to get involved in the debate and those sorts of perspectives. Our role is to try to identify individuals who have the qualifications to provide you with recommendations. And
okay, so it kind of organically happened
because please understand, then we would have to make assumptions about what the different sides of an issue might be and who might be representing what perspective, and whether or not that's fair. Like I don't think that's a role that we should be playing as a state agency.
So when she was saying that the groups had a focus, mostly one was on avoidance, mostly another was on reduction, that kind of just organically happened.
I think I'm sorry. I think she's directing that at me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Thank you.
So we can't anticipate what the recommendations are going to be out of any given group. I think you're hearing from one work group member about characterizing the recommendations of groups that she was a part of and groups that she wasn't a part of. But if you asked other work group members, I don't know how they would characterize the recommendations. We can certainly try to get more folks who have actually been on the work groups to weigh in on that for you. Again, we try to be very focused on the task and the responsibility that we have in order to try and create these groups to provide you with the recommendations that you're looking for.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate again that I want to be very point out that staff has done a great job at making sure that she's not looking at perspectives, and staff is not looking at perspectives, that they're looking at the most qualified. And I do feel strongly, and I will not direct them for any part of a future work group to vary from that stance moving forward.
May I speak into work group E? I just wanted to.
Ms. Kuykendall, hold on. I think this
Sure.
was a question from Ms. Davis to staff.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
Davis, if she has any further questions for this. Okay, so next was Ms. Perez Diaz.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm glad that Ms. Davis asked the question. I do agree, Chairman, with the role that we play currently. I don't think it's our place to identify. But what I do want to say is I think it's a little bit of there's a misrepresentation on the consensus from Work Group D. I am aware of the fact that there was no consensus on certain topics. And so Work Group D had to go back and forth and essentially ended up landing on the abstinence only because they were referring back to previous work. But my understanding is that there was no consensus on, one way or the other. So I'm a little nervous about going into another work group for a couple of reasons, but I wanted to ask. So I think first of all, personal standards for dating, was that something that came out of Work Group D, or is that something that Member Bajorich is recommending? I think I just need some clarity on that.
Are you asking the testifier or Ms. Bajorich?
It's just my recommendation that there be some practice on what that might look like.
Okay, got it. I just needed some clarity on that because I think that if we decide to move in the direction of Work Group F, one of the things that I'm a little concerned with is again, I don't want to be lost on this board the fact that we heard from multiple testifiers yesterday who never once mentioned, problems with breakup or anything like that. They were talking about rape. They were talking about sexual assault. And they were wanting to know about things like that and how to address those issues. So if we're going to talk about, if we're going to talk about issues and how to address them, I think we really need to speak to what's happening in school and not an idealistic version of what we hope would happen. The other question I wanted to ask is, if we do go down this rabbit hole of personal standards for dating, I would very much ask that we not take a binary approach. Again, we need to acknowledge that we have LGBTQIA students across the state in every single one of our districts, and they need to be represented in those personal standards of dating as well. And when I say represented, I don't mean just general language. I mean we need to specifically address sexual identity. Gender identity and sexual orientation. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was, the last question I had. So, we've heard "just say no" several times, and it's sort of reminiscent of the war on drugs from the 80s. And that was a very reactionary campaign. And so the one thing I want to ask Ms. Kuykendall is, do we want to continue to be reactionary, or do we want to be proactive and put in abstinence plus comprehensive sexual education, so that individuals have the information ahead of time should anything happen? That way we're not being reactionary, because again, everything that we heard yesterday from our youth, they're asking to learn about these things through a vetted process from professionals. So, do we want to be reactionary?
Well, I would go back to our definitions or confusion over definitions. I have not advocated, nor did Workgroup D come to bring to you recommendations about abstinence only. Just say no. We've built out a whole comprehensive set of skills needed to achieve optimal health and make decisions with informed knowledge, medically accurate, age-appropriate, science-based information that points standards to a primary prevention choice of avoiding their risks, and gives them good information about their inherent risk should they choose to not make that behavior. And so I don't think that's reactionary. I think what we've done is built out a much broader attempt, given the big if we can, at addressing these issues for all students in Texas. So I don't know if that helps, but I think I wouldn't consider it reactionary when we're promoting healthy relationships and communication skills and setting and respecting and communicating boundaries and all of the other content that's there.
Any other questions, Ms. Perez-Diaz? Okay, I think Ms. Cargill has, she said, one quick question on direction to give. Is this to the testifier or to the board?
It's to Lori.
Okay, so we will do that. I think I'll let you get to that one, but I do want to say that probably after that, we need to make sure this agenda item was to focus on our discussion among the board to give direction to what the next step is going to be between here and first reading. So after this question, I want to try to get to that part.
Okay, so Lori, you mentioned that that Workgroup D was very focused on making sure that the letter of the law was followed. And so you might not know this. I didn't take count, Ms. Bahorage did, I don't know, like 900 emails to support Texas Education Code 28.004. So a lot of those people couldn't come in to testify or didn't sign up to testify, but sent emails instead, which is fine. But what advice would you have for a work group going forward? Changes that Workgroup E might have made that don't comply with 28.004. Are you worried about anything? Or you mentioned several things at the beginning that you were concerned about. Is that in testimony that you're getting to us? Or
yes,
I want to make sure we give directions to the next work group. If there is non-compliance, we need to look at that.
Sure. So I think that I've addressed where marriage was added to with committed relationships, where the law says abstinence until marriage. So anywhere we can uphold marriage would be important to stay legally consistent. I've mentioned my concerns around consent education because I think it promotes towards sexual activity where the law clearly points away from sexual activity. And then I did mention emotional risk. Of course, the law states emotional trauma, and our work group agreed that trauma was a dated word that didn't focus it the way we wanted to. So we wrote emotional risks to stay consistent with the risk language throughout. And I would note, if I could, about work group D, were there places there were not consents, you would have seen the MV, right, the multiple view written if we didn't reach consent on what we brought forward coming out of work group D.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank Ms. Kuykendall. You've been with us, the trooper, all day yesterday and today. I thank you for being here with us, and thank you for all your work you've done.
Thank you all. I appreciate your service.